Hey, David, you got any retirement plans?
It's a golf course on McNabb's Island. It's always been a plan, always been a vision.
Hello and welcome to the Grand Parade Podcast. I'm your host, editor, and City Hall reporter for the Grand Parade newspaper, which exists out in the world as a physical newspaper as of this morning. And for those of you who are interested, you can find a copy at Atlantic News over at the corner of Queen and Morris, or the Dart Gallery if you're on the Dartmouth side, which is on Portland Street, and probably a couple of other locations, but I haven't been able to confirm them by the time that I've started recording. So head on over to Blue Sky, and I'm going to make a pinned post on the Grand Parade Blue Sky account, and the top post will tell you where you can get this paper. And before getting into City Hall news, I just wanted to say thanks. As I'm writing the script of this podcast, I am looking at a rough draft of a newspaper, an actual physical newspaper. And the paper's existence is, if I'm being honest, quite humbling and overwhelming. There are a lot of people who I could not have done this without, and so I just want to say thanks to a few people who have helped me get this paper off the ground. First and foremost, Chris, the owner of Atlantic News, who convinced me that starting a newspaper that he could put on in his store was a good idea. To the editors in the city who had coffee with me and tried to poke holes in this idea, well, the joke is on you. I found holes that none of you could think of, but we're good. We got through. I'd also like to thank Antonia for their phenomenal writing in this first issue. And if you're listening to this while drinking your coffee, first off, good morning. And second, when you go out this week or today, pick up a copy of the paper. Antonia's feature about Maddie's deadly bus stop is phenomenal. I'd also like to thank the other writers who are just as good, but for now, they will remain a secret for suspense-building purposes. But you know who you are, and thank you. And finally, I'd like to thank everyone who's supported this paper by becoming a paid subscriber. It has given me the stability I needed to offer writers for this paper a decent rate. And in the interest of transparency, this paper operates on a profit-sharing model. When you buy a copy of the paper, our writers get an equal share of the revenue. So go buy some newspapers so journalists in Halifax can buy some food. And in exchange, I will do my best to ensure that Halifax's City Council is always held to account. So, thanks. And with the thanks out of the way, let's move on to City Council news. On Monday, Halifax's Executive Committee got an update from the Gender Equity Advisory Committee and did a bunch of stuff in camera. The only real highlight here is that Councillor Tony Mancini asked the Women's Advisory Committee to come to a Board of Police Commissioners meeting to discuss their work on intimate partner violence. On Tuesday, there was a regular meeting of council, which was dominated by a debate about downtown and some flooding bylaw changes. First in the meeting was a presentation from the Downtown Halifax Business Commission. Just as an advisory note, I keep writing Downtown Dartmouth Business Commission, which means that at some point in this episode, I will probably mess this up, and I'm writing and recording this copy in advance, and if you hear this, it's because I've left it in because I've screwed it up somewhere. Or I've left it in so you listen to it twice, and I can pad my stats. We'll never know, never know, never know, never know. Anyways, the Downtown Halifax Business Commission gave a presentation on their 5-year plan, Vision 2030, which calls on council to invest heavily in downtown Halifax because, as Paul McKinnon, the president of the Downtown Halifax Business Commission, told council.
And before we go into those details, I want to talk a little about why downtown is important to all of HRM's citizens, all the way from Ecom Secom to Hubbards. First of all, just the math makes it important. As you know, HRM's revenues primarily come from property taxes. Those tax revenues come from all over the municipality, but take a look at these stats. Almost 16% of the city's commercial taxes are generated in the tiny area that we call downtown. District 7 alone represents 10% of the entire residential tax base, and a full quarter of residential assessment values are from the peninsula. It's also worth noting that the dense development pattern of downtown makes it the most efficient area to service. This combination of high assessments and efficient servicing costs makes downtown the prime revenue driver for our municipality. Indeed, this holds true for any city, and many studies have demonstrated that.
And even though it is true that downtown is the main economic engine for the HRM, that's politically inconvenient for most councillors whose rural or suburban constituents incorrectly believe that they pay too much in property taxes and don't realize that their suburban or rural property tax rate is extremely low relative to the cost to the municipality to deliver services to their low-density housing. This is all very heavily subsidized by downtown. This is why, after the presentation, Councillor Laura White put forward a motion to see how the city could align their priorities, or to see which of the city's priorities aligned with the priorities of the Halifax Business Commission's Vision 2030. Councillor Sam Austin was quick to point out that fiscally and geographically speaking, Dartmouth was also part of the economic engine that is downtown. And for anyone who needs a quick eyeball test when it comes to property tax fairness, places like Fairview are dense enough to be a revenue driver for the city, but places like Bedford or Cole Harbour are low density to the point that they are an economic drag on this city. They hinder us from achieving our true potential. Stay tuned this spring or summer to see if the suburban plan will lift Halifax's suburban fiscal anchors, and so we can set sail for a better tomorrow. At any rate, Sam Austin was worried that White's motion was too premature, saying that,
speaking as this side of the harbor, like we're going through some big picture thinking about downtown Dartmouth, the waterfront, Alderney Landing, about renewal of that facility. It'd be kind of silly. I mean, I don't think we have a budget for 2 performing arts centers if we are going down one path on one side and another path on another, for example. So, I think we should have the report come back, and then council should look at the pieces that we want to do rather than jumping to implementation. So I would ask that the motion be separated, because I don't, implementation's too soon. I want to have a report that looks at this whole thing.
Or in other words, if you include both sides of the harbor, we already have a golf course downtown in Brightwood. But if the city just focuses on implementing the Vision 2030 plan, aka the Halifax side of the harbor plan, they might spend money they didn't need to on Hensby's dream golf course, and once that money's spent in Halifax, it can't then also be spent in Dartmouth. The CAO tried to convince Austin that the city's plans were holistic, so Halifax would only implement stuff that was in Vision 2030 and Halifax's strategic plans, but Austin remained unconvinced. This motion was split into 2 parts, with council unanimously approving to see how the 2 plans aligned, but the implementation half was voted against by Councillors Sam Austin, Trish Purdy, and Patty Cuddle, and seeing how they were outnumbered, they were unsuccessful. And just to be clear, the Downtown Halifax's Business Commission plan does not include a golf course on McNabb's Island. That was just an example. Please don't get excited, Mr. Hensby. The other big ticket item from this meeting was the floodplain update. And although this is really important for the people who live along the Sackville River, for the people who don't live on that river, the only thing you really need to care about is that council voted unanimously to do the right thing. And for those of you who live close to the affected area, I'm going to drop the full 20-minute staff presentation into the show after the closing theme for those who need or want more details and in the general kind of interest of public knowledge. On Wednesday, the Special Events Advisory Committee met and gave their new members an orientation. They also recommended council pre-approve, pending annual budget approval, 4 years of grant spending. On Thursday, May 1st, there was 2 canceled meetings. The Harbour East Marine Drive Community Council and the Environment and Sustainability Standing Committee were both canceled. Based on Sam Austin asking permission to miss the Environment and Sustainability Standing Committee, I suspect that these were both canceled due to lack of quorum. The Youth Advisory and Women's and Gender Equity Committees met on Thursday to talk work plans. The Women and Gender Equity Committee also talked about the senior safety strategy. Also on May 1st, the Point Pleasant Park Advisory Committee got a presentation from Tom Tollick, Captain Navy, retired, about the historic fortifications in Point Pleasant Park. This is a pretty cool history lesson that you can just go watch for free. It's hidden in plain sight in a video titled May 1st, 2025, Point Pleasant Park Advisory Committee on the HRM's YouTube channel, which is just it's incredible. There is one person who listens to this podcast from Sweden. First off, who are you? Please email me, tell me your story. I'm so curious. Second, someone in Sweden, after listening to this, may now go get a history lesson on Halifax's fortifications for free. This committee also learned that climate change is wrecking the coast of Point Pleasant Park and learned about Coast Reach, which is how scientists are crowdsourcing data about coastal erosion by letting people visiting a park use their cell phones. This is funded by the federal government and run by a university out of Ontario, and the city of Halifax just gets this data for free. With this crowdsourcing science and a history lesson in Sweden, just remember, as AI makes technology feel like it's absolute garbage, technology, if you think about it, is actually amazing. And to round out this committee meeting, park staff gave a presentation on their ongoing Sisyphean battle to keep the roads in Point Pleasant Park maintained and the invasive species in check. They're holding, mostly, on both fronts. But this was a short presentation because city staff who gave this presentation was on duty and had a serious call that he needed to respond to. And finally, not related to a committee meeting, but I got a document that I've been trying to get for a while, and I'm still diving into it and trying to figure out the implications. But so far, it seems like part of the reason that Halifax isn't achieving its strategic priorities and plans in transportation is due to how the city defines its core service delivery in the realm of transportation. My quest for this document started on April 8th when the CAO told council this.
The second question, I believe, was how we define core services. There is a service catalog that we updated prior to the municipal election, which is available on the councillor's site, reference material intranet site, which lists all of the municipal services, and we have defined those that are essential and non-essential. So if you look at what's listed as essential services, I would argue those are our core services, the ones we've got a legislative mandate, we must provide them.
And so far in reading this document, I've been left with more questions than answered. For example, if one of Transit's core services is defined in this document as being in charge of Transit's capital projects and new transit services, then why are they not in charge of the Robie Street Transit Corridor? Unless that's not actually a transit capital project, or in service of implementing a new transit service like Bus Rapid Transit, because otherwise Robie Street should be under Transit's authority. But since the Department of Public Works are actually the ones in charge of the Robie Street redevelopment, they have to follow their core service deliveries as defined by this catalog, which includes accommodating all modes of travel, including cars. And even though Halifax is a city that prides itself on evidence-based policy, that's only so long as the evidence isn't the city's fiscal reality or the laws of physics that govern the natural world. Because due to the massive size and cost required for car infrastructure, there is no accommodating all modes of travel if you also include cars in the infrastructure. Cars are so big and expensive, it is impossible for the city to put any money into any of its other transportation priorities if it also has to include cars. You remember off the top of the last episode when I played that clip of Megan Sorokum talking about the Windsor Street Exchange? This clip?
Really, the design that we have now is trying to balance all of the road users' impacts and trade-offs that we have.
That is the definition of the core municipal service of traffic management that the Department of Public Works has to follow. But traffic management, defined like that, is self-defeating. As New York and its congestion pricing and Netherlands and its transportation planning prove, you can't manage traffic by accommodating all modes of travel. You can only manage traffic by removing cars, and you can only remove cars by providing realistic alternatives. And you can't afford the space or the money for realistic alternatives if you have to accommodate car traffic. The city's definition of traffic management, I believe, is the reason why the city is incapable of accomplishing any of council's transportation priorities. The city has to choose between accommodating cars or achieving council's priorities, and right now, the Department of Public Works is following a set of instructions about core service delivery that forces them to choose an option that undermines council's approved strategic transportation plans in ways that waste hundreds of millions of dollars in taxpayer money, in ways that needlessly and preventably kill people, and in ways that cause climate change. And they're not doing anything wrong. They're just doing exactly what they are being told to do in the municipal service delivery catalog. So yeah, that's why nothing's getting better in Halifax. Everyone's doing exactly what they've been told to do, but exactly what they've been told to do is defeating everything else they've been told to do. Fucking A. And that's it. That's it for me this week. That'll do it. It was a busy week. You got to get to a lecture about floodplains in the lower Sackville River. So in the meantime, you can find me at Grand Parade. No, you can find me at Land of Sticks, wherever signs are bought and sold for free. You can find the newspaper at grandparade.news. You can find the newspaper in a physical store, which is at Atlantic News, which is at the Dart Gallery in Dartmouth. And maybe I'm going out on a limb here. No, I'm not going to do it. Go to the Grand Parade on Blue Sky and see where it's sold. If you want to pick up a copy next week, there's going to be at least 2 locations. There might even be 4. There may even be more than that. Who knows? We're going to see. It's going to be a wild weekend where I'm going to be delivering a whole bunch of stuff. But I got to get to that, which means I can't be editing this on the weekend, so I got to go. Enjoy your lecture about the floodplain. See you next week. Bye.
Thank you. So tonight we're here to present to you the proposed policies and regulations respecting the Sackville River floodplain update. In the course of this presentation, we are going to give you a bit about the project history, floodplain mapping, and proposed land use policies and regulations. And I would like to apologize just a tad in advance. We're going to go as quickly as we can through a very long history, but we might go slightly over time. I apologize in advance, Deputy Mayor.
When it comes to Sackville, you have lots of lenience, right?
Thank you very much. The community and staff have put a lot into this. Thank you. So in the way of the project history, the Sackville River floodplain, as outlined in your staff report, has a very long history dating back to the 1980s when the Canada-Nova Scotia Flood Damage Reduction Program floodplain mapping was first introduced. The former municipal units, over the course of several years, adopted those regulations under policy and land use bylaw amendments from 1987 to 1994. Having heard from the Sackville River Business Association in 2008, the municipality embarked upon a process to hire teams of engineers and to undertake studies dating up to 2024 to bring to you the proposed floodplain mapping and regulations. From 2020, last year in 2024, we had a number of meetings with the community in Sackville and Bedford to present the proposed regulations and policies. We took those back and refined those regulations in accordance with what we heard, and that we're here to present to you tonight what we think is the best proposed policy set to meet the community interest and interest of the municipality. So without further ado, Helen.
Thank you, Maureen. So I'd like to give a very brief overview on how the flood modeling and mapping work was done for this project. So more than 50 individual model scenarios were analyzed to determine which common set of variable watershed conditions returned the largest response to a set amount of rain within the modeled scenarios. These variables include things like common seasonal conditions, how much development there is in a given area, how long a rain event might be, historic rainfall and flow patterns, projections associated with climate change, and also how these variables and others might change into the future. Then, those conditions that produced the largest response in the model, the largest flood responses in the model, were combined to create a watershed that represents that combination of common conditions. Then specific rainfall amounts are added into that combined conditions watershed, and this is what the flood model is. The results of that model are then applied to a digital surface of the Sackville River's watershed within the mapped area to create what you see here, which is a visual display of how the river system is forecasted to respond to that combination of conditions and rainfall events, which is a floodplain map. And in August 2018, Regional Council directed staff to amend the relevant planning documents as were recommended in this study. Next slide, please. After this project was reinitiated in 2023, the team agreed that the 2017 map should be updated to include new information that wasn't available in 2017 and to update some bridges that had been changed. The recommended base model from the 2017 study was used as the foundation of this update, with the new bridge information included. No other assumptions within that model were changed. The model results were then applied to the most recent digital surface of the watershed available, which is from 2019. Generally, the 2024 maps were found to be similar to the 2027 maps, with the observable differences mainly near the updated bridges. And that brings us to the floodplain map we have today, which is shown here. Again, a floodplain map is a visual display of a combination of possible ways the river system may respond to a combined set of common watershed characteristics. For the Sackville River subwatershed, the conditions were winter seasonal conditions and a 48-hour storm. And in the Little Sackville River subwatershed, fall conditions and a 24-hour event were used. Floodplain maps are traditionally produced to show the combination of ways a river system is forecasted to respond to a 1 in 20 and 1 in 100 year design rainfall event in the area being mapped. A 1 in 20 year flood, which is shown on the screen here in blue, has a 5% chance of occurring in any given year. This is called the floodway in the proposed policy. A 1 in 100 year flood, which is the pinky purple that you see in your set here, has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. And this is called the flood fringe in the proposed policy. The likelihood of such a flood happening is not affected by how recently a flood of any magnitude has occurred in the area. That likelihood does not change on a year-to-year basis. It is not expected that all of the areas indicated on this map will always flood at the same time during a single flood event. The areas that do flood in response to a specific rain event will likely vary depending on the season, how wet the soil is, how long the storm lasts, and so on. The purpose of a floodplain map is to show on one page all of the areas within that mapped area that are at that 5% and 1% probability of being flooded in any given year. I'll also call you back to the direction given to staff by Regional Council in 2018 to amend the relevant planning documents to implement development controls based on the recommendations of the 2017 floodplain study. And Maureen will now discuss those proposed amendments and the process to develop them.
Thank you, Helen. And without further ado, I'd like to tell you that the public engagement process for this planning process has been extensive. It began with the uploading of the Sackville study maps in 2018 and the maintenance of a Sackville Rivers webpage where a plethora of information was provided, and it attracted somewhere in the order of 19,000 views. I'd like to tell you that 7,000 of those came most recently in the past year. We held 3 open houses in 2018 to review the study results of the CBCL study, and we held 6 public meetings last summer to share with the public the proposed draft regulations for feedback. And notifications for all events were sent out to 2,655 people. I know the staff report says 967. I need to point out that means properties. That's how many properties are on the floodplain. But the residents, tenants, and property owners constitute over 2,600 people. What we heard at those meetings, well, we heard from the public that they wanted protection from flooding. We also heard initial concerns in 2018 about the age of the data and the need to update the floodplain mapping, which we did in 2024. We also heard there were concerns about the potential for devaluation of property, and we heard concerns about the loss of opportunity to acquire overland flood insurance. We also heard from the public that there was a need to prioritize other floodplain regulations that came out of the 2020 Sackville Rivers flood mitigation study before introducing development controls. But this was the #1 recommendation of all studies to begin embarking upon change. We heard that people had concerns about the loss of development rights, especially for vacant lands. And we heard that there was a need to allow permitted uses in adjacent designations in the flood fringe, to be considered in the flood fringe. And we heard that from the members of the public that they were all also concerned about the impacts of development on upstream or downstream flooding, and cautioned us to proceed carefully. We also heard from the public that there was a need for emergency exits during a flood to facilitate acquisition. Heard from property owners, having a great deal of difficulty during the last flood event, and so we wanted to bring that to your attention. Our response to public feedback, well, as Helen pointed out, we updated the floodplain maps in 2024. We're also proposing to allow the consideration of uses permitted in the abutting designation in the flood fringe. And we're proposing to allow consideration of innovative designs for land development that are braced for flood impact, which I will explain momentarily. But we do feel that development controls are needed before infrastructure upgrades can be undertaken. To coin a phrase from the public information meetings, we have to stop making things worse before we can make things better. We are also, as a municipality, requesting federal provincial assistance for buyouts for those properties that are subject to recurrent flooding, and as recommended for buyouts under the Sackville Rivers Mitigation Study. And we are undertaking, Council has recently directed us to undertake a region-wide emergency access assessment of all subdivisions throughout the municipality to determine appropriate ways for accessing and egressing areas that are subject to emergency events. Property valuation. Before leaving this slide, it's not typical of the municipality to do property valuations. That is a matter that is undertaken by the PVSC, Property Valuation Services Commission, an organization that's independent from the municipality, and for good reason. But the concerns about property valuation has not been lost on our ears. So we took a look at the assessment values along the Sackville and Little Sackville River floodplain, since we've had zoning in effect in these areas for the past 37 years in the case of Beaverbank, Hammonds Plains, Upper Sackville, and 31 years in Sackville, and more in Bedford. So when looking at the assessed values along the floodplain, we did not observe any devaluation in property values. We looked at the Hallmark Avenue area, for example, a residential community that has properties backing onto the Little Sackville River, and properties that are not affected by the Little Sackville River at all. In those cases, the 32 lots that were backing onto the river had a value range between $43,000 and $601,000 under the 2025 assessments. The interior lots were worth, according to the assessed values, that is, $394,000 to $504,000 in range. So they were worth less in assessed value than the riverfront properties backing onto Hallmark Avenue. And we observed the same condition throughout the floodplains. So we're not acting as property valuation specialists here. We're just merely reporting the information that we see in the assessment rolls. And but I do encourage people living in the area to contact the Property Valuation Services Commission if you have specific questions about how the property is evaluated. So without further ado, I'd like to come to the floodplain management strategy. And I want to advise that we're taking an adaptation approach to floodplain management aimed at the protection of people, property, and infrastructure. We recognize that there is a great deal of existing non-residential development along the floodplains of the Sackville and Little Sackville River. And we're proposing to allow innovative design that is designed to withstand a flood and prevent impact on upstream and downstream properties. We also are proposing to allow for certain developments where they can assist in the restoration of the natural floodplain through the provision of resilient infrastructure that's designed to attenuate floods. The first thing we need to do in the strategy is to amend the regional plan by stating that that where the municipality has identified flood risk areas, municipal planning strategies and land use bylaws have to be reasonably consistent with the Nova Scotia Statement of Provincial Interest, which is a requirement that we have under our charter currently. The Statement of Provincial Interest requires us to maintain the Canada-Nova Scotia Flood Damage Reduction Program floodplains that were delineated in the 1980s and adopted under the relevant municipal planning strategies from 1987 to 1994. New floodplains, such as the ones that we have identified beyond those river extents, are what are called known floodplains under the Statement of Provincial Interest. And we can regulate to the minimum standard of the flood fringe in those areas, and we have a strategy in mind of things that we can do. But to do anything in the way of allowing new development or alteration or of the grade of land, we have to undertake, in accordance with the Statement of Provincial Interest, hydrotechnical studies to confirm that the proposed alteration or development will not cause upstream or downstream impacts, and that it will not result in the alteration of river flows. So without further ado, the 4 municipal planning strategies and land use bylaws affected by the Sackville River floodplains policies and regulations include Bedford, Sackville, Sackville Drive, and Beaverbank, Hammonds Plains, Upper Sackville, containing the community of Lucasville. The floodplain designation under these planning strategies will include all existing flood damage reduction program floodplains, as well as all new floodplains. Within this designation, we're introducing 3 new zones. In addition to that, we're going to maintain the existing floodplain zones as required by the Statement of Provincial Interest, but we're proposing for those areas that are beyond the extents of those Canada-Nova Scotia Flood Damage Reduction Program lines, the application of a 2024 floodway overlay zone, which would apply to the 1 in 20-year floodplain, a 2024 flood fringe overlay zone, which would apply to those dark areas or the shown on this map, which include the areas of the 1 in 100-year floodplain or flood fringe. And we're also proposing to introduce a modified flood-proofing area, which I'll explain a little later in the presentation. Within the 2024 floodway overlay zone, the permitted uses would include resource uses where appropriate, conservation uses, roads, public utilities, recreation uses, trails, parking lots, all existing non-residential uses, which is part of the adaptation approach to floodplain management. For those existing non-residential uses, those uses would be permitted as legal conforming uses, and provided there's no expansion, but the building could be redeveloped to the extent of its current existence in the event of destruction or need for redevelopment. We would also allow the change in use to a permitted use in the underlying zone, provided that use does not involve any residential type institutions that would be difficult to evacuate, or any use of hazardous materials. Within the floodway overlay zone, some conditions would include no new buildings or structures, no off-site fill, grade alterations with a hydrotechnical study. Within the flood fringe overlay zone, the uses permitted would include all uses permitted in the underlying zone, except for, again, those residential type institutions that would be difficult to evacuate, or uses involving hazardous materials. Within the flood fringe overlay zone, we would allow offsite fill to be imported for flood proofing to elevate the building out of the flood fringe. We would allow grade alterations, and both of these activities would require a hydrotechnical study. Flood proofing, that means that you would have to elevate the floors above the nearest upstream 1 in 100 year elevation, which we've provided for the convenience of the public so they don't have to hire land surveyors and endure the cost of trying to figure out where they are on the map. However, if a property owner wanted to hire a land surveyor, we would accept the survey elevations for the 1 in 100 year flood elevation for that property in terms of authorization of permitted uses. They would also have to elevate for flood proofing electrical and mechanical equipment above the 1 in 100 year flood level unless the structure is designed to withstand a flood. Areas no longer in the floodplain. There are a few of them. This map here shows the Sackville River crossroads, for example, and the area with the blue arrow pointing to it are properties that were within the Canada and Nova Scotia Flood Damage Reduction Program floodplains, but the updated studies show that they're no longer in those flood extents. So in those areas, because they're in the Canada and Nova Scotia Flood Damage Reduction Program area, we still have to regulate to an acceptable standard to keep people out of the flood conditions if they, for example, excavated below the 1 in 100 year elevation. So in those areas, structures below the 1 in 100 year elevation would have to be designed to withstand a flood. Habitable floor space above the 1 in 100 year elevation would be required, and electrical and mechanical equipment, like in the other zones, would have to be elevated above that 1 in 100 year level. We also are proposing to authorize the use of development agreements for the careful consideration of the introduction of new development, expansion to an existing non-residential use, or new development of a non-residential use on a vacant parcel of land, if a hydrotechnical study is submitted verifying that the proposed development would not cause any upstream or downstream impacts, or alter the river flows as required by the statement of provincial interest. In those areas, we would require that the building be flood-proofed and designed to withstand a flood. And we would also be looking for designs that mimic the services of nature, with the development of structure, resilient infrastructure on the site that could attenuate flooding. And we would also require in those areas the submission of an evacuation plan for access and egress in the event of a flood. In the way of this policy, we realize that riverine, the flood extents change over time. And we're proposing that this policy be reviewed every 10 years as information becomes available, as new modeling techniques become available, as new data is provided, we plan to review. We understand this is not a static element, and it is subject to change, and we plan to take good adaptive environmental management. So without further ado, Council, we recommend that you adopt the proposed amendments to the regional plan as set out in Attachment A, and that you also adopt the proposed amendments to the Beaverbank, Hammonds Plains, Upper Sackville, Bedford, Sackville, and Sackville Drive municipal planning strategies and land use bylaws as set out in attachments B1 to B4 and C1 to C4. Thank you.